Welcome to our first Life on the Inside podcast. To kick things off, and in honour of World Health Day, we are discussing depression and hormonal health with our head practitioner, Elizabeth Mucci. So, what are some of the things we should be conscious of when it comes to depression?
I think with any disease or issue in our body, with any particular area, there's a whole heap of biochemistry that's involved. One important factor would be, is there a genetic predisposition for this? And have a look at grandparents, and not just your parents, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts. Because if that's there, it might already be that we've got a predisposition. We don't necessarily have to have that display itself, but we might have to change our lifestyle to help that condition turn off so that we're not suffering from it. So that's something that's pretty important to think about. And then other things that can influence those genetic sort of predispositions. And then there's other things that you might not have a genetic sort of predisposition for this at all, but you might have emotional stresses, and so therefore counselling would be really good in that situation. So where you might have a really toxic environment, or you might have been brought up in a really toxic environment, and therefore that's change the way you might handle situations, and you might be less resilient to particular situations. And so that would be a path maybe to seriously look at, and what you can do to strengthen that. Or you might have a predisposition to hormonal issues, and so therefore certain conditions that can affect your balance of hormones can then start to influence how you handle a situation in particular times of your cycle. And so that's a bit of a clue. So if you think, I was really happy for half of my cycle, and then all of a sudden I'm very dark, if not even suicidal, at other times of your cycle, it would be useful to plot down when you're feeling depressed. Is this something you're feeling all the time, or is this something that you might feel, for a week every month? So that's something that then you would go down a different path, as well as maybe looking at counselling and genetic sort of situations, as well as, well, hang on, maybe I've got to address what's causing these hormonal disruptions. And then depression can come as a result of gut function issues. So people tend to leave that out and look at, when did this depression start? Were you happy for most of your life, and then all of a sudden you've travelled overseas, you've got something that might be affecting the gut function, and then all of a sudden your serotonin, which is your happy hormone, is being depleted, and then you're going down a depression pathway of medication instead of maybe looking at what's causing that in the first place. So I think a lot of this is about really knowing yourself really well, and just having a look at, how is this depression displaying, and what tools do you need to sort of get on board, and what part of it can you play? Are you exercising at all? That drops your depression by quite a lot. Just one, really knowing yourself really well would be where you would start, and then knowing how to sort of handle that particular depression in that particular person. So it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Can we just circle back to what you were saying in regards to hormones specifically? So it's an area that there's a bit of controversy around, from my understanding, with psychologists, right, and with, other healthcare professionals and healthcare practitioners. So how do we start to look at depression in terms of, is it related to PMT, PMS, and then, postnatal depression? Are these factors that we need to think about in relation to depression specifically, or is it more a hormonal issue, or is it both?
So what I tend to see in my practice is that a lot of women that come to me with PMS or postnatal depression, there's been clues along the way that has shown them that, they might have needed some correction in maybe lifestyle, or they've got family sort of history where there's been a lot of hormonal issues. So endometriosis, say, for example, can actually make you more prone to depression. Or you might hear a history where a mother's had a hysterectomy at a very young age because her hormones were, not controlling that sort of system. And also suffered from depression, and then she gets a hysterectomy and all of a sudden she's feeling a lot better as a result. So I think to say it's only just the way that you handle situations would be a bit narrow, because that's not what I'm seeing in my room. So a lot of time as I'm approaching the balancing of hormones and the correcting of maybe lifestyle that's affecting those hormones, women within a very short period of time are feeling that they're no longer depressed. They're a lot happier. A lot of their PMS has disappeared. The way they view the world is a lot better, but they haven't done counselling in the meantime. So it's a very quick turnaround in some women that within a month or 2 months, they've actually, they've already gone down a lot of the counselling road in the past, and they just feel like they're stuck in this rut going round. So it's like, I've learnt this situation, but when it gets to a certain time of my cycle, I'm finding everything goes out the window, and I still feel this excruciating, darkness that comes over me. And then when they're corrected hormonally, they just say the darkness isn't there anymore. And really, that's what the aim is when you're hormonally balanced, you shouldn't really feel too much of a difference throughout that cycle. That cycle should be that, mentally and emotionally you're fairly stable. So I would use it as a clue. I would see if you are getting PMS, use that as your body crying out that, hey, you're doing something in your life that's disturbing my hormones, and therefore address that. For instance, a lot of alcohol use is going to increase estrogen and drop progesterone in a lot of situations. And when you're hitting that week before your periods are due, you might all of a sudden see that you've got a lot of PMS or irritability. You're like a different person. Some people say, this witch comes out for that week and they're really different, and they view the world really differently. They can't sort of contain their emotions. And then they're dealing with all the guilt after that because they've, said things to their partner or their kids that they really regret. But it's only for that short period of time. And then the rest of the time, they handle the same situation very differently. So I think that's the big clue, is to sort of go, is this just showing up at a particular time? And therefore you've got all the skills the rest of the time to handle these situations. And then all of a sudden, in that particular week or a few days before, it's like you're a totally different person. What we know is if they're suffering that, they tend to have a high estrogen to progesterone ratio. And so we've got to look at things that can lower those estrogens and things that increase the progesterone. So if we're wanting to increase progesterone, exercise is a good thing to do that. And we know that exercise also just helps with general depression anyway. And so that's something that they would have to just slot in their day and be quite disciplined to sort of, say I either go for a walk for 20 minutes a day, or I make sure I do some really high intensity sort of exercise 3 times a week to help balance other systems in the body. So it's not just a hormonal thing, it's usually how your body's dealing with sugars, insulin, feedback systems from the brain. It's actually quite complicated, but because exercise is dealing with so many of those, we know that if they just exercise, usually it's balancing a whole heap of biochemistry that's affecting that particular part. So that's one thing. Definitely exercise has to play a role. The other thing is knowing that the things that raise estrogens, a lot of them are animal fats and alcohol. So I think things like looking at a lot of refined foods, sugars, alcohol is a big one. Coffee, drinking too much coffee can be an issue as well, because you're stimulating a nervous system that then, has become quite dependent on the alcohol sugar, for instance, because alcohol is, a lot of its wines are high in sugars. And so you've set up these situations that then you're still behaving the same way lifestyle-wise in that week before your period, but your hormones aren't allowing you to actually, that lifestyle for that particular period of time is quite disturbing to the biochemistry.
So, what would you say to women who suspect that, oh, actually, maybe I do feel depressed, but I'm not clinically depressed. I don't have depression for 2 or more weeks, but I do get depressed, and it could be maybe this is a hormone-related issue. What would they need to start doing to recognise that or to become aware of that?
So I suppose some of the ways we might, start to realise maybe it's more a hormonal issue is if we start to pay more attention to our cycle. So a lot of people don't. They just sort of, it is what it is. But if we start to plot down, maybe even diarise, okay, this is day 1 of your cycle, the day that you bleed, and as you go through, just start diarising for a couple of months what your emotions are, even on each day, and see if there's a pattern that's showing up, and how you feel on each day. So if you sort of think, hang on, I'm feeling fantastic on these days, then we know it's less likely, without medication, that it's less likely that it's clinical depression, because that's more going to be a consistent sort of thing. And you might find that, 25 out of the 28 days you're feeling pretty good, and then you're feeling really dark and sad, or all of a sudden all the past comes back, and they're on particular days. Or you might find not only that it's premenstrual, but right around ovulation will be another weak spot. So you might go around day, 13 or 14 of my cycle, I was teary and sad, and I was remembering everything that, my partner did that I was angry about, or something like that, and then it's gone again. I think it's just really helpful if we can plot it throughout a cycle and we can see some patterns. That's what I like to do with my patients, and I do see that not just with depression, but other things are influenced that way as well. And so you might see anxiety all of a sudden come up at certain times of the cycle, or you might see cravings come up at certain times of the cycle. And so then it's more about, okay, what can I do to perfect that cycle, and help me, lessen those sort of highs and lows in those particular times. And that's what you would be looking at, especially for those who have already done a lot of counselling. And they're finding that, yes, it helps on a certain level. It's helping me understand myself on a deeper level and what strategies I might put in place on those particular times. But if we can, a lot of people are living there, especially younger people, and it is a bit of a vicious cycle where if you're feeling down, we tend to live a little bit more destructive lifestyles on those particular days where, you just tend to eat yourself silly and all your junk food comes back because you don't really care because you're feeling quite down. Or you might drink a lot so that you're drowning out the sorrows. Or you might start, some people will take drugs and those things then last in your system for quite some time. So you're just in this vicious spiral that's spiraling down. So I think it's more about, being real, really getting to know what is my background, what is my genetic background. If I do have this predisposition, accepting that, and then, looking at how you can lessen that sort of that biochemistry. And it always comes back down to knowing yourself, eating clean, living a healthy lifestyle. I always like to sort of think, if we were out in a jungle right now like we should have been, what would be the reality of our lifestyles? What time would we wake up? What time would we go to sleep? And in that, even just in that, there tends to be a lot of biochemistry that's balanced out. The sky gets dark at a certain time. It raises melatonin. That's going to let us go into a sleep quite early, usually by 9, 10 o'clock if we've got a fire burning, and then you would go off into this sleep really well because we wouldn't have had our hands on a lot of sugar, so we wouldn't have been wired up. There's just all this biochemistry in our world today that's being stressed as a result, and so therefore we've got all these disease states and ailments that are coming around it. So I think if we just sort of bring it down to, look, if I was out there, what would be my lifestyle? I'd be up pretty early. Birds would be chirping. I'd be up at about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. I would have already gone and got water down at the well. You'd be moving. You'd be maybe climbing up, steep sort of slopes, and you'd be moving a lot more. We tend to not do that. So, which is why, you get countries where as soon as they hit the winter, a lot of people are committing suicide, or they're getting a lot of depression because the sunlight's going down. So then we've got other issues there as well. So serotonin is, something that we need to look at. If it's not just a genetic thing, or if it's not just a hormonal thing, or a combination of both, there's gut function as well. Because the gut is responsible for producing most of the serotonin, if there is an underlying condition there, you might find that you're going through doing everything else, and you've balanced your hormones, you've spoken to counsellors, and then all of a sudden you're still feeling some form of depression. It might be lighter, or you might handle it better, but it's still sort of there. I particularly, when I hear depression with patients, I usually always deal with the gut while I'm dealing with everything else, and look at the gut's health. But if we look at the conditions where, say, for instance, you have an upset tummy, you might have got a gastric sort of, or gastritis, or something like that, or picked up a bug. Often what happens in that scenario is you might find that you're depressed for those days that you're suffering with those conditions. A lot of people do. And usually if someone comes to me saying, that they're feeling down or depressed and they don't know why, I usually ask, have they been overseas? Have they found that they've had an upset stomach lately? And a lot of the time they say, yeah, actually I have. My tummy is actually playing up. So that would be something you definitely wouldn't want to ignore in this sort of subject anyway. You want to be looking at, what is the health of my gut, and go, if everything's fine, then at least you're narrowing down. I usually look at these problems like a funnel effect. You look at all the things that could be influencing it, and, like a checklist, try and make sure that they're taken care of, and then is the problem still there? If the problem's still there, you're narrowing down the reasons it could be there.
Okay, so it sounds like really what you're saying is that, the first step is to notice, be more aware of your mood, and when you're feeling what you're feeling, have a way of recording that, and then being open to the possibility that there's a lot of things to explore in this, and that there could be multiple factors, or that's having an effect on someone's mood. And what do they do once they're aware of that? What should they go see their GP? Should they go see a psychologist? What's the next sort of step?
So I think definitely getting some practitioners involved in this is going to speed up the process of repair and discovery. I think a lot of people, might take this on board themselves and think, oh, that's great, yep, got it, and I'll change these few things, and that might help for a couple of people, out there, a few people that they sort of think, yeah, well, I'm eating a lot of junk food, and as soon as I stopped doing that, I felt a lot better. So they are definitely going to get a benefit. But I think if it's really something that is quite constant in your life, or it's somewhere that you tend to go very quickly, so you might be quite pessimistic, and it is something that might have a lot of background, like where you think, look, I've always been like this. You know, as soon as there's a problem, I get very dark and negative and I lose all my hope for something. Definitely counselling would be something that I think is going to be extremely helpful in speeding up the process of you getting to know yourself. If it's something where you need some nutritional advice and you're thinking, well, I actually don't know what's really right for me, because what might be right for somebody might not be right for you. And then, yes, you would source a nutritionist and or a naturopath or a dietitian, whichever you prefer, and you could maybe go through your GP to see which one they might suggest in that particular situation. If it's medication, you know, first line would definitely be your GP, and they will guide you in which way to sort of go. Psychologists will do the same. They might guide you, so if they will know whether how much of this is at the seriousness of the problem behind what they're sort of dealing with. And then, but definitely I think if you can source help from the outside, it's going to speed up the process, make it clearer what you're actually dealing with. And, you know, they have to guide you because it depends on the problem. So because the problem can be multifaceted. So you would look for someone that can actually, you know, deal with the lots of different problems and know someone that will listen and take the time to sit down and listen to you and what you come to them with. You know, it would be great for you to go to a practitioner saying, I've noticed that these are the times I feel depressed, or I've noticed that these are my triggers for this. Then that'll help them know which way to sort of approach it, I think. Yeah.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about.
You're welcome.
And happy World Health Day.